The day I walked into the federal courthouse in downtown Charleston to testify against my husband. I wore a navy blue suit my father had bought me the year I made junior partner at his firm. I had not worn it in 11 years. It still fit. I remember thinking on the morning of the testimony that this was the suit I had been saving for the most important meeting of my life, and I had not known, when I hung it in my closet a decade earlier, what that meeting would turn out to be. The trial of Daniel Whitaker, who the indictment now correctly named as Daniel Robert Mercer, began on a Monday in February, 15 months after the night I dropped a wine glass on our kitchen floor. The case had drawn national attention by then. 3 networks were parked outside the courthouse with satellite trucks. A podcast had already released 6 episodes about the case before the trial even started. A best-selling true crime author had written a magazine piece called The Architect's Husband, which I refused to read because I had lived it once and had no interest in living it again on someone else's pages. Before we go any further into the story of what happened inside that courtroom, before we hear what Daniel said when he finally took the stand, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened over the 11 days of the trial of Daniel Whitaker, and what he did on the morning of the verdict, and the question he asked me in the holding corridor afterward, is the part of this story that almost never gets told. It is the part that explains, finally, who he really was. And it is the part that I have only ever told once before, under oath on a witness stand, in a navy blue suit my father had bought me when I was 26 years old. The lead federal prosecutor on the case was a woman named Eleanor. She was 48 years old, originally from Birmingham, and she had spent the last 12 years of her career prosecuting interstate fraud and homicide cases for the Department of Justice. She had a quiet voice and an extremely calm face, and Maya had told me, the first time I met her in a conference room in the federal building, that Eleanor was the most dangerous lawyer in the southeastern United States, because juries trusted her the way they trusted their own mothers. Her opening statement on the first morning of the trial lasted 43 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. She walked the jury through the timeline of Daniel's life like a tour guide walking visitors through a museum, pointing out the artifacts of a career that had spanned 3 states, 4 identities and at least 8 victims. Eleanor Hastings in Atlanta, Margaret Doyle in Phoenix, Patricia Arn in Portland, Howard Pierce in Charleston, my father, who had been murdered at a business dinner 6 months before Daniel ever shook my hand, and then me, Claire Whitaker, the one who had not died. Eleanor told the jury in that quiet voice that the only reason they were sitting in that courtroom was because of a forged signature, a folded handkerchief, and the curiosity of a woman who had picked up an envelope in the back of her husband's sock drawer when she had only been looking for a cufflink. She said that the case they were about to hear was not, in the end, a case about murder. It was a case about a man who had built an entire identity out of the lives of the women he had married, and who had nearly succeeded in adding one more name to his list, and who had been stopped only because that woman had refused to be afraid. Daniel sat at the defense table in a grey suit his attorney had bought for him. He had lost weight in the 15 months he had spent in federal custody. His hair was thinner. His skin had the grey cast of a man who does not see sunlight. But the most striking thing, the thing the press kept commenting on through the entire trial, was that he never once looked at me. Not on the first day. Not on the 3rd day. Not on the day I walked past the defense table on my way to the witness stand and stood not 6 feet from him for almost a full minute while the bailiff swore me in. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table in front of him, and he stared at a point somewhere on the wall above the jury box. I had wondered for 15 months what it would feel like to be in the same room with him again. I had wondered if I would be afraid. I had wondered if some part of the woman I had been before, the woman who had loved him, would surface in me and make me hesitate. None of that happened. What I felt, sitting in the witness box waiting for Eleanor Sayers to ask me her first question, was something I had not expected at all. I felt nothing. I felt the way you feel when you walk past the apartment building you used to live in 20 years ago and you do not recognize a single face on the street. He was a stranger. He had always been a stranger. The only difference now was that I knew it. The prosecution called 41 witnesses over the 11 days of the trial. They called the insurance agent who had processed the $2 million policy in Daniel's name, a man named Gerald Phipps, who testified that the woman who had come into his office in February to sign the application had been wearing sunglasses and a wool hat pulled low over her ears, and had refused to remove either of them, citing a migraine. Gerald Phipps had never seen my face. He had only seen a signature. They called the document examiner from the FBI's forensic lab in Quantico, a woman named Dr. Helen Cho, who walked the jury through a side-by-side comparison of my real signature and the forgery on the policy, projecting both signatures on a screen above the witness stand. She pointed out the slant of the C. She pointed out the missing loop on the W. She testified, in the certain and quiet voice of a woman who had been doing this work for 26 years, that the signature on the policy had been written by someone who had practiced my handwriting extensively, but who had never seen me sign my own name in person more than 3 or 4 times. The implication was clear. Daniel had been practicing my signature for months before he ever filed the application. He had been preparing to forge me before he had finished marrying me. They called the forensic chemist who had analyzed the bottle of red wine I had refused to drink in our kitchen on the night of his arrest. His name was Dr. Marcus Bell, and he testified that the wine had contained a compound called tetrodotoxin, derived from the internal organs of certain species of pufferfish, in a concentration that would have been fatal to a woman of my body weight within 90 minutes of ingestion. Tetrodotoxin, Dr. Bell explained to the jury, is one of the most difficult poisons in the world to detect in a routine post-mortem examination because it metabolizes quickly and leaves almost no trace on standard toxicology screens. It would have mimicked, in my case, a sudden cardiac arrhythmia. The same arrhythmia that had killed Patricia Arn in a bathtub in Portland in 2018. The same arrhythmia that had killed Margaret Doyle on an empty stretch of highway outside Phoenix in 2016. The same arrhythmia that had killed Eleanor Hastings in her bed in Atlanta in 2014. And the same arrhythmia the medical examiner who had reopened the case would later testify that had killed my father at a business dinner in 2015, in a glass of bourbon that Daniel Mercer had handed him across the table while smiling and asking him about his daughter's career. They called Robert Ellis, the private investigator, who walked the jury through the months he had spent assembling the folder he had laid on Maya's kitchen table. They called Agent Diane Foster of the FBI, who walked the jury through the 3 weeks I had spent wearing a wire and the moment that the panic button had been pressed and the front door had come off its hinges. They called Maya Bellamy, who told the jury about the morning I had slid an envelope across a coss table at a coffee shop and asked her what I was supposed to do. They called the sisters and brothers and grown children of the 3 dead wives who had flown in from Atlanta and Phoenix and Portland to sit in that courtroom and finally, after years of believing their loved ones had died of natural causes, hear the name of the man who had taken them. The sister of Patricia Arn, a woman named Grace, sat in the front row of the gallery every single day of the trial. She wore the same locket every day, the locket that Patricia had been wearing on her wedding day, the locket that had been excavated from the wooden box, buried 3 feet down beneath the English roses in our garden. Grace had asked the prosecutor's office if she could wear it during the trial. They had returned it to her on the morning of the first day. She did not take it off until the verdict was read. On the 8th day, the prosecution called me. I sat in the witness box for almost 6 hours, broken across 2 days, and I told the entire story from the beginning. I told them about the wine bar. I told them about the book about cathedrals. I told them about my father, and the chapel on Meeting Street, and the way Daniel had said his name without lowering his voice. I told them about the envelope, the handkerchiefs, the folded socks, the sea with the wrong slant. I told them about the night I lay in bed beside my husband and listened to him breathe, and understood that the arm across my chest was going to be the arm that buried me. I told them about the wire, the pendant, the shape of the small house Daniel had given me on our 5th anniversary, the house with the garden that turned out to be a trophy case. And I told them about the wine glass, the moment it slipped out of my hand, the way the smile had left his face for 1 full second, the face that had been underneath. Eleanor Sayers asked me one final question, just before she ended the direct examination. She asked me, Mrs. Whitaker, what do you think your husband would have done if you had drunk that glass of wine? I have thought about that question for 15 months. I had thought about it almost every night. And I gave her the answer I had arrived at, somewhere in the long quiet of those months. I said, I think he would have held my hand while I died. I think he would have told me he loved me. And I think he would have meant it, in the only way he was capable of meaning anything, because what he loved was the ending. He had loved the ending of every one of us. The wedding was just the beginning of the story he was telling himself. The funeral was the part he had always been writing toward. The defense did not cross-examine me. Daniel's attorney, a man named Philip Crane, stood up at the defense table, looked at me for a long moment, and said, "No questions. Your Honor, I have always wondered whether Crane made that decision on his own, or whether Daniel had instructed him not to let me speak about him for 1 second longer than I already had. I think it was Daniel. I think, somewhere in him, even at the end, the thing he could not stand was being seen." The defense case lasted 2.5 days. They called 3 witnesses. A character witness, a man Daniel had known in Indiana before he had ever changed his name, who testified that Daniel had been a kind boy in high school. A forensic accountant who attempted to argue that the financial trail was circumstantial. And a psychologist who had interviewed Daniel twice in custody and who attempted to suggest that he suffered from a dissociative condition that might have impaired his judgment. The character witness admitted under questioning that he had not spoken to Daniel in 22 years. The forensic accountant admitted that he had not been provided with the wire recordings before forming his opinion. The psychologist admitted that her diagnosis was based on Daniel's own self-reported history, which was, by his own attorney's admission, almost entirely fabricated. Daniel did not take the stand in his own defense. Philip Crane rested the case at 3:47 in the afternoon of the 11th day, and Eleanor Sayers delivered a closing argument that lasted 1 hour and 11 minutes, and the jury went out at 4:50 that evening, and they came back the next morning at 10:32, with a verdict on every count: guilty, 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 guilty. 10 counts. 4 first-degree murders, 1 for my father, 3 for the wives, 1 attempted murder for me, 3 counts of insurance fraud, 2 counts of forgery. The foreman, a retired schoolteacher in her 60s, read each guilty without looking up from the page. Daniel did not move. He did not flinch. He sat at the defense table in his grey suit with his hands folded in front of him, and he stared at the same point, on the wall above the jury box that he had stared at for 11 days, and he did not look at me. Not even then. I should tell you about the morning of the verdict. because it is the part of the story that the press got wrong. The press reported that I sat in the front row of the gallery, between Maya and Grace, and that when the verdict was read, I closed my eyes and cried. I did not cry. I have read 4 different articles that say I cried. I did not. What I did when the last guilty was read was reach over and take Grace Ann's hand. She had been holding her sister's locket between her fingers for the entire reading. Her hand was cold. She squeezed mine so hard I could feel her wedding ring pressing into my knuckles. We sat there like that. 2 women who had never met before the trial, holding hands in the front row of a federal courtroom while the man who had killed our family was led out in handcuffs. Grace whispered something to me as he was being walked past the gallery. She said he never looked at us. Not once. He never looked at any of us. And I understood in that moment what Daniel's silence had been. It had not been guilt. It had not been shame. It had been the same thing it had always been. He could not stand to be seen by the women he had used. We had been objects to him in life. We were objects to him in court. The verdict did not change that. Nothing was ever going to change that. The only difference was that now he was the object. He was the one being looked at. He was the one being judged. And he could not stand it. He kept his eyes on the wall. But there was one moment in the holding corridor outside the courtroom that I have never told anyone about until today. After the verdict was read and the jury was dismissed, Agent Foster came over to the gallery and offered to walk me out through a back hallway because the press was already gathered on the front steps of the courthouse. I agreed. Maya came with us. Grace stayed in the courtroom with the families of the other victims. Agent Foster led us down a marble staircase to a service corridor on the ground floor of the building, a long hallway used by the marshals to transport defendants between the holding cells and the courtrooms. We were not supposed to be in that corridor at the same time as a prisoner transfer. Someone, somewhere, had made a scheduling mistake. As we turned the corner near the elevators, 2 federal marshals appeared at the other end of the corridor, escorting a man in a grey suit with his hands cuffed in front of him. It was Daniel. He was being walked to the transport van that would take him to the federal facility in Atlanta, where he would be held pending his transfer to Colorado. He saw me at the same instant I saw him. The marshals saw it. Agent Foster saw it. Maya saw it. For 3 or 4 seconds, the entire corridor stopped moving. Daniel stood at one end of the hall and I stood at the other, and the distance between us was maybe 60 feet, and we looked at each other, for the first time since the day in our kitchen, when I had dropped the glass of wine. He spoke first. He had to raise his voice to be heard across the corridor. The marshals tensed. Agent Foster put a hand on my arm. Daniel said, "Claire." Just my name. And then he said the only sentence he ever said to me again in his entire life. He said, "Did you ever love me?" The marshals started to move him forward. Agent Foster started to move me backward. Maya was already saying my name, telling me we needed to go, telling me not to answer him. I did not move. I looked at him standing in the middle of that corridor in handcuffs in a suit his lawyer had bought him, and I thought about the wine bar in April, and the chapel on Meeting Street, and the coffee in the garden on every anniversary morning for 9 years, and the arm across my chest at night, and the smile in the kitchen, and I gave him the only honest answer I had. I said yes. I did. And then I turned around, and I walked out of that corridor, and I did not look back, because the woman who had loved him was dead. She had died in our kitchen on a Thursday night in September. The woman who walked out of that courthouse was someone else entirely. Someone who would build, in the years after the trial, a foundation in my father's name that has now helped over 400 women across the country recognize the warning signs of marriage fraud and intimate partner homicide. Someone who would speak at FBI training conferences about the patterns that almost killed me. Someone who would, on the second anniversary of the verdict, marry a kind, quiet man named Thomas Bellamy, Maya's older brother, who had known me since I was 22 years old and who had loved me without ever once saying so. Until the day, 2 years after Daniel was sentenced, when I finally asked him why he had never married. He said, "Because I was waiting for you." And I believed him. Because some people are exactly who they say they are, and you only learn to recognize them after you have known the other kind. Daniel was sentenced 6 weeks after the verdict. He received 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 40 years for the attempted murder and the fraud and forgery counts. The judge, an older man named Walter Stenson, who had been on the federal bench for 29 years, gave a sentencing speech that the press would later call the most blistering judicial statement of his career. He said that in his 3 decades on the bench, he had never seen a defendant who had so thoroughly weaponized the institution of marriage. He said that Daniel Robert Mercer had not been a husband, had never been a husband, but had been a predator who had used the wedding vow as a hunting blind. He said that the women who had married him had not been wives. They had been prey. And he said that the sentence he was about to impose was not, and could never be, sufficient punishment for what had been done to them. But it was the most the law could do, and he intended to do all of it. Daniel was led out of the courtroom for the last time at 11:17 in the morning of April the 3rd. I was in the gallery. So was Grace. So were the families of Eleanor Hastings and Margaret Doyle. He did not look at any of us. He kept his eyes on the wall. He has been in custody at the federal facility in Florence, Colorado, for almost a decade now. He has not had a single visitor in all that time. He has not written a single letter. He has not given a single interview, despite being asked, I am told, by more than 30 journalists and 3 different documentary filmmakers. He is, as far as anyone knows, the most successful marriage fraud killer in the modern history of the United States. And he sits in a cell in a mountain, and he does not speak, and somewhere in him, I imagine, he is still staring at the wall above the jury box, because that is the only place he was ever safe. The only place he was not being seen. I want to end this story not with him, because he has been the subject of enough sentences in this country, but with the woman I sat next to in the front row on the morning of the verdict. Grace Ann flew home to Portland the day after the sentencing. She and I have stayed in touch ever since. She speaks at events for the foundation. She wears her sister's locket every time she does. 3 years after the trial, on a rainy afternoon in November, Grace called me from Portland and told me that she had been going through a storage unit her sister had left behind, and she had found a letter. The letter was sealed in an envelope marked, "To be opened only if something happens to me." Patricia Ann had written it 3 weeks before her death. She had written it because, she said in the letter, she had begun to suspect that her husband, the man she had married 6 months earlier, was not who he claimed to be. She had not been certain. She had not had enough to go on. She had been afraid that if she told anyone, she would be wrong, and she would have ruined a marriage out of paranoia. So she had written a letter instead, sealed it, hidden it, and waited. She had been planning, the letter said, to take it to a friend within the next 2 weeks. She had run out of time. The letter named Daniel by the name he had been using in Portland. It described his behavior. It described her suspicions. It described, in the last paragraph, a moment in their kitchen when he had poured her a glass of wine and smiled at her, and she had looked at him and thought for the first time that she did not know the man she had married. Grace read me the letter over the phone. I sat on the floor of my office for a long time after we hung up, and I thought about how close I had come, on a Thursday night in September, to being the second woman who had written that, thought down and never been able to say it out loud. Patricia Ann had seen the smile too. She had just not had the time to drop the glass. I did. And the only reason I did is because she did not. Because somewhere in the long memory of how predators work, in the patterns that the FBI now teaches at training conferences using my case, there is a chain of women who almost got there. Eleanor almost got there. Margaret almost got there. Patricia almost got there. My father almost got there. They built with their lives the inch of certainty I needed to drop a wine glass on a kitchen floor. I am not the woman who survived Daniel Whitaker. I am the woman who survived because of the women who did not. And every word of this story belongs to them. That is the end of the true story of the marriage that became a grave. If you have ever felt in your own life the small wrongness that you are afraid to name, the receipt in the wrong city, the phone that lives face down, the smile that does not quite reach the eyes, please listen to me. Trust the wrongness. Drop the glass. Make the call. Open the envelope. The woman who picks up the cuffling is the woman who lives. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this story. If it moved you, please share it. Somewhere out there is another Claire, in another kitchen on another Thursday night, with another smile across the table from her. And she may not know yet what she is looking at.